Chairwoman Maloney, and members of this committee, the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol was unconscionable. I'm grateful for the opportunity to provide needed context and insights to this committee about the events of that day and what I believe was your military's appropriate response. This is long overdue. I'd first like to express my thanks for the first responders who tried to contain the mob and defend the Capitol complex and the individuals there. They are true heroes. And that word is overused oftentimes, but definitely not in this case. And as we assess the response, we should not lose sight of their brave actions that day. I served as the acting Secretary of Defense that day, and as such, I was ultimately responsible for Department of Defense support to local and federal law enforcement agencies who held primary responsibility for safeguarding the Vice President, the members of Congress, and the Capitol complex. My background is summarized in my written statement, but I served in the Army for over 30 years, including service in the District of Columbia Army National Guard, and in units with responsibility for protecting Washington, D.C. I have personally led our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in combat in urban environments. Following my retirement from the Army as a full colonel, I resumed government service in a variety of positions in the prior administration, including the National Security Council, where I focused on defeating al-Qaeda and retooling the government to address the challenge of domestic terrorism. I was unanimously confirmed by the Senate to serve as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. On November 9th, 2020, I was designated as the acting Secretary of Defense and served in that position until the new administration took office. I'm now a private citizen, but I remain focused on supporting the members of the armed forces, veterans, and their families. As to the events leading up to January 6th, on December 31st, 2020, Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser sent a written request to Major General William J. Walker, Commanding General of the District of Columbia National Guard, seeking unarmed National Guard support to the District of Columbia Metropolitan Police Department for planned demonstrations scheduled for 5 and 6 January. I formally approved the request on January 4th, 2021. We received no further request for different or additional support until the Capitol was breached. I want to highlight, you said in my opening statement, I want to clarify between 1 and 1:30, I noticed that the outer perimeter had been breached, not the Capitol itself. I know that's sometimes difficult to understand, but that's one of the purposes of this hearing today, is to make sure we get our lexicon straight. I want to remind you and the American public that during that time, there was irresponsible commentary by the media about a possible military coup, or that advisors to the president were advocating the declaration of martial law. I was also very cognizant of the fears and concerns about the prior use of the military in June 2020 response to protests near the White House. And just before the Electoral College certification, 10 former secretaries of defense signed an op-ed published in the Washington Post warning of the dangers of politicizing and inappropriately using the military. No such thing was going to occur on my watch, but these concerns and hysteria about them nonetheless factored into my decisions regarding the appropriate and limited use of our armed forces to support civilian law enforcement during the Electoral College certification. My obligation to the nation was to prevent a constitutional crisis. Historically, military responses to domestic protests have resulted in violations of Americans' civil rights, and even in the case of the Kent State protests of the Vietnam War, tragic deaths. In short, I fervently believe the military should not be utilized in such scenarios other than as a last resort, and only when all other assets have been expended. On January 6, 2021, 8,000 local and federal law enforcement officers were on duty in the District of Columbia. I was told during planning sessions that such a force routinely manages demonstrations well north of 100,000 demonstrators. That is what they are trained, equipped, chartered, and expected to do. Many commentators have mischaracterized my instructions and Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy's accompanying guidance as somehow contributing to the inability of the Guard to respond, or even worse, that those instructions somehow enabled the mob to enjoy an easy path to the Capitol. That is completely false. We did not disarm the National Guard. The request from the mayor was for unarmed support of local law enforcement, and we authorized the support she and General Walker requested. At about 2:30, it became clear to me that local and federal law enforcement personnel were insufficient to address the situation, and the Department of Defense would be required to play a much larger role in reestablishing order and maintaining security in Washington, D.C. At 3 p.m., I approved the activation and mobilization of the full District of Columbia National Guard to assist the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department. At 5:20 p.m., National Guard personnel arrived at the Capitol and began operations in support of domestic law enforcement entities there. Order was restored by 8 p.m. that evening, and Electoral College results were certified. Those of you with military experience or who understand the nature of military deployments will recognize how rapid our response was. Criticism of the military response is unfounded and reflects inexperience with or a lack of understanding of the nature of military operations, or worse, is simply the result of politics. I suspect a combination of both these factors. There are complexities to redeploying forces in an urban environment. And again, the critics disregard the subordinate role the military must play in the rare instances it is necessary to use such force to support domestic law enforcement agencies. This isn't a video game where you can move forces with the flick of a thumb, or a movie that glosses over the logistical challenges and the time required to coordinate and synchronize with the multitude of other entities involved, or with complying with the important legal requirements involved in the use of such forces. I have been in more crisis situations than I can meaningfully recall. I have personally been in riots, fistfights and brawls, gunfights, aircraft mishaps, mortared, rocketed, attacked with improvised explosive devices. And as a leader, I have commanded forces engaged in the most complex and hazardous military activities and operations known to humankind. Good leaders slow things down to plan and then brief their soldiers, ultimately saving time and lives. Assembling soldiers, equipping them correctly, conducting an abbreviated planning session, and briefing all those involved with their task, mission, purpose, limits, and rules of engagement. Coordinating and synchronizing with the police and other domestic agencies on the ground to guarantee the National Guard's movement supported their efforts. Moving them from the assembly point to the appropriate location and deputizing them by a civilian law enforcement official prior to employing them. This is not a mere symbolic exercise. It all takes time. I also had a responsibility to the members of our armed forces and their families to make sure that when I sent them into difficult situations, I sent them in with a plan to not only succeed, but that would spare them unnecessary exposure and spare everyone the consequences of poor planning or execution. Our arrival needed to impress upon the mob that the situation had fundamentally changed with the arrival of disciplined, organized, and overwhelming strength, so that the balance of power had decisively shifted back in favor of the forces of order, and it was in their best interest to give up, and give up quickly. And I believe it did. Again, anyone familiar with the culture, nature, and practices of the military and the character of military operations in urban environments would understand the enormous accomplishment of the District of Columbia National Guard and Army leadership in responding so effectively and quickly that afternoon. As General Milley correctly assessed, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military's response that day, the Department of Defense responded at, quote, sprint speed, unquote. I stand by every decision I made on January 6th and the following days. I want to emphasize that our nation's armed forces are to be deployed for domestic law enforcement only when all civilian assets are expended, and only as the absolute last resort. To use them for domestic law enforcement in any other manner is contrary to the Constitution and a threat to the Republic. I ask you to consider what the response in Congress and in the media had been if I had unilaterally deployed thousands of troops into Washington, D.C. that morning against the express wishes of the mayor and the Capitol Police, who indicated they were prepared. I know that the brave law enforcement officers serving on the front lines on January 6, 2021, did their best to protect the Capitol and the individuals, many of who are on this hearing today, were in harm's way from a lawless and ignorant mob acting contrary to nearly 2.5 centuries of peaceful and respectful transfers of power under our Constitution. I'm enormously proud of those National Guard soldiers and airmen who selflessly answered the call on January 6, 2021, and in the subsequent weeks to support domestic law enforcement and our Constitution. Watching them talking to them, listening to them, and trying to support them as best I could remain the high points of my term as the acting Secretary of Defense. They are America's treasure and our true patriots, We must be worthy of their selfless service and sacrifice. Thank you.